The story of suffering begins long before the modern mind began to dissect it in lecture halls and laboratories. It is etched into the earliest attempts of humanity to make sense of the pain that rises like a tide in the human heart. Imagine, if you will, a wandering ascetic sitting beneath a solitary tree, his mind a storm of questions, his body bruised by the elements. That is the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, on the night he resolved to sit beneath the Bodhi tree until the truth of suffering, dukkha, unfolded before him. In that stillness, the first noble truth emerged. Life is marked by suffering, not merely the occasional ache of a broken bone, but a pervasive unsatisfactoriness that pervades birth, aging, illness, and death. The second noble truth identified the root, the hidden engine of this suffering, craving or tanha, a thirst that springs from ignorance, the veil that blinds us to the impermanent nature of all phenomena. When the Buddha finally pierced that veil, he proclaimed the third truth, that the cessation of suffering is possible, that the flame of craving can be extinguished, and the fourth, that the path to that cessation is the Noble Eightfold Path, a disciplined way of seeing, thinking, speaking, acting, earning a livelihood, making effort, practicing mindfulness, and cultivating concentration. As the Buddha said in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, now this, monks, is the noble truth of suffering. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, death is suffering, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are suffering. The calm, reflective cadence of his teaching invites us to listen not only to the words but to the spaces between them, where the breath of insight settles. Contrast this Buddhist articulation with the ancient Indian worldview that wove suffering into the fabric of karma and moksha. In the Vedic and later Upanishadic traditions, suffering is not an inexplicable curse but the natural consequence of actions, karma, performed in ignorance of the true self, the Atman. The Bhagavad Gita, spoken on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, frames suffering as the inevitable fruit of desire, yet also offers a route out. Surrender to the divine will, perform one's duty without attachment, and thereby purify the mind. Krishna tells Arjuna, when a man has given up all desire for sense gratification, and when his mind is thus satisfied in the self, then he is said to be a man of steady wisdom. Moksha, liberation, is the cessation of the cycle of birth and death, the final release from dukkha, but achieved not through the extinguishing of craving alone, as in Buddhism, but through the realization of the self's identity with Brahman, the ultimate reality. Both traditions recognize a fundamental unsatisfactoriness, yet they diverge on the metaphysical ground. The Buddhist doctrine of anatman, no self, denies any permanent essence, while Hindu thought affirms an eternal self that merely becomes entangled in the web of karma. The Greek world, separated by continents and languages, arrived at its own intricate tapestry of ideas about suffering, often framing it as a catalyst for the ascent of the soul rather than a mere obstacle to be avoided. Plato in the Republic imagines the soul as a charioteer driven by two horses, one noble, one unruly. Suffering, for Plato, is the sting that awakens the soul from the darkness of the cave, urging it to seek the light of the forms. In the Phaedo, he writes, the soul that has been accustomed to the pleasures of the body, when it is freed from the body, will be in a state of great suffering. Yet this suffering is not an end in itself. It is the crucible in which the soul is purified, enabling it to contemplate the good. The allegory of the cave itself is an analogy of suffering. The prisoners, chained in darkness, endure the pain of ignorance, and only through the painful ascent to the surface do they glimpse true reality. The philosopher, therefore, embraces suffering as a necessary step toward the ascent of the soul, a view that resonates with the Buddhist notion that insight often follows the breaking of comfortable illusion. Aristotle, whose ethics are grounded in the cultivation of virtue, approached suffering from a more practical angle. In the Nicomachean Ethics, he distinguishes between pleasure and pain, not as moral absolutes, but as signals that guide the virtuous agent toward the mean. He observes that pain is the feeling of the soul that accompanies the loss of something good, and that a virtuous person feels pain at the prospect of acting unjustly, just as a child feels pain at the loss of a toy. For Aristotle, pain is not inherently bad. It is an integral part of the moral education of the individual. The pain that accompanies the practice of temperance, for instance, teaches the individual to restrain appetite, thereby shaping character. In this sense, suffering becomes an instrument of moral development, a theme that will echo through the Stoic tradition. The Stoics, perhaps the most systematic of the ancient Greek schools in addressing suffering, turned the focus toward the dichotomy of control. Epictetus, a former slave-turned-teacher, opened his lectures with a simple yet profound maxim: some things are in our control and some are not. He taught that the only true source of suffering is the judgment we place upon external events, not the events themselves. When a ship is tossed by a storm, the storm is indifferent. The sailor suffers only if he judges the storm as an injustice. In his discourses, Epictetus reminds us, it is not the things themselves that disturb us, but our opinions about them. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who wrote his Meditations amid the clatter of swords on the Danube frontier, offers a vivid illustration of this teaching. Imagine him, armor clanking, the scent of blood in the air, yet he pauses to write, "If you are distressed by anything external, it is not this thing that disturbs you, but your own judgment about it." He writes these lines on parchment while the thunder of battle roars around him, a testament to the Stoic conviction that inner tranquility can be preserved even in the midst of violent external turmoil. The Stoic practice of premeditatio malorum, anticipating misfortune, was designed not to invite suffering, but to inoculate the mind against the shock of unexpected pain, much like a vaccine prepares the body for disease. These ancient doctrines, while emerging from disparate cultural soils, share a striking commonality. They all recognize that suffering is not a random accident, but a condition that can be examined, understood, and in some sense transformed. Yet even within these traditions, voices of dissent rose, challenging the prevailing moral valuation of suffering. Pyrrho of Elais, the founder of ancient skepticism, questioned whether suffering even possessed any moral significance. He argued that because our senses are unreliable and our judgments are perpetually uncertain, we cannot claim that any particular experience, painful or pleasant, holds an objective value. In his fragments recorded by later skeptics, he is said to have advised, "Suspend judgment and you will achieve tranquility." If we cannot be certain that suffering is inherently bad, then perhaps the pursuit of its elimination is misguided, or at least not a universal moral imperative. The early Epicureans, led by Epicurus himself, offered a different counterpoint. While often caricatured as hedonists, Epicurus taught that the goal of life is ataraxia, peace of mind, achieved by minimizing pain and maximizing modest pleasures. He famously declared, "Death is nothing to us, for when we are, death is not, and when death is, we are not." For Epicurus, pain is a natural limit to pleasure, a boundary that teaches us to seek simple, sustainable joys rather than endless cravings. He warned against the fear of gods and the fear of death, both sources of unnecessary mental suffering. In his letter to Menocius, he wrote, "Do not spoil what you have by desiring what you have not." This pragmatic approach reframes suffering not as a metaphysical problem to be solved, but as a practical condition to be managed through wise choices and the cultivation of friendships. When we look back at these ancient narratives, we see the seeds of later existential and phenomenological explorations of suffering. The existentialists of the 20th century, from Sartre to Camus, would echo Plato's claim that suffering awakens the soul, but they would add a twist. The absurdity of existence itself is a source of anguish that cannot be resolved by transcendent truths, only by an authentic embrace of freedom. Camus, in the myth of Sisyphus, likens human life to the endless rolling of a stone up a hill, an image that resonates with the Buddhist image of the endless cycle of samsara, yet he insists that we must imagine Sisyphus happy, finding meaning in the very act of struggle. Phenomenologists such as Husserl and Heidegger would later dissect the lived experience of suffering, describing it as a being toward death that reveals the finitude of existence, much as the Buddha's insight into impermanence reveals the root of dukkha. The Stoic focus on the internal versus external also anticipates modern cognitive behavioral therapy, which teaches that it is not events but our interpretations that generate distress. In this way, the ancient dialogues about pain and its transformation continue to echo in contemporary thought, proving that the human preoccupation with suffering is a timeless thread weaving through philosophy's tapestry. Let us return for a moment to the vivid scene beneath the Bodhi tree. The night was heavy with the chorus of crickets, the moon a pale lantern in a sky smeared with clouds. Siddhartha sat cross-legged, his eyes half closed, his breath a slow tide. As the night deepened, he recalled the Four Noble Truths, each revelation like a petal unfurling. He saw that birth, aging, death, sorrow, and lamentation were not isolated misfortunes but facets of a single condition, dukkha. He observed that craving, desire for sensual pleasure, for existence, for non-existence, was the engine that kept the wheel turning. Ignorance, the failure to see the impermanent nature of all things, kept the rider bound to the saddle. In that moment of profound insight, he realized that the cessation of craving would end the cycle, that the eightfold path was the map out of the labyrinth. He rose from his seat, his eyes bright with the dawning of nirvana, and the world, as he later taught, became empty of self but full of compassion. The Buddha's own words, recorded in the Dhammapada, still reverberate. All conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. This anecdote does more than illustrate a historical event. It serves as a living metaphor for the transformative power of insight, a theme that recurs in every philosophical tradition that grapples with suffering. Now picture Marcus Aurelius on the battlefield of the Marcomannic Wars, the clatter of steel echoing across the Danube, the cries of wounded legionaries rising like a mournful hymn. In the midst of this chaos, the emperor pulls out a small leather tablet, the ink still wet, and writes, "Remember that you are a part of the whole, a fragment of a larger cosmos, and that your pain is but a ripple in the river of time." He pauses, listening to the distant thunder of artillery, then continues, "Do not be disturbed by the opinions of the many, for they are like the wind that blows over the sea." This image of a ruler, burdened by empire yet seeking inner serenity, captures the Stoic conviction that even the most extreme external circumstances cannot dictate the tranquility of the mind. It also illustrates a practical application of the dichotomy of control. The battle is beyond his power to stop, but his response, his judgment, is entirely his own. The emperor's meditation, written in the heat of conflict, becomes a timeless reminder that suffering can be reframed, not erased, by the stance we adopt toward it. The Hindu concept of karma also provides a vivid illustration of suffering's moral dimension. In the Mahabharata, the warrior Arjuna faces a crisis of conscience on the field of Kurukshetra, his heart heavy with the prospect of killing his own kin. He laments, "How can I lift this bow and slay those I love?" Krishna's response, delivered in the Bhagavad Gita, reframes his suffering as a duty, dharma, aligned with the cosmic order. "You have the right to act, but not to the fruits of action," Krishna declares. Here, suffering is not an aberration but a necessary moment in the performance of one's role in the grand tapestry of existence. The lesson is that the pain of ethical conflict can be transcended by aligning personal action with universal law, a notion that finds a parallel in the Buddhist emphasis on right action as part of the Eightfold Path, yet diverges in its affirmation of an eternal self that fulfills its dharma. The Greek skeptic Pyrrho, traveling with Alexander the Great's army, observed the chaos of conquest and the fickle nature of perception. He concluded that certainty is unattainable and that the wise person should suspend judgment, thereby achieving ataraxia. If suffering arises from the judgments we place upon events, then by suspending those judgments we can dissolve the sting of pain. This skeptical stance anticipates the Buddhist practice of seeing phenomena as they are, without the overlay of conceptual labeling. Yet Pyrrho's radical doubt also raises a counterpoint. If we cannot be sure that suffering is inherently negative, perhaps the pursuit of its elimination is a misguided project. This tension between the certainty of suffering's moral weight, as asserted by the Buddha and the Stoics, and the skeptic's claim of epistemic humility, creates a fertile ground for philosophical inquiry. The early Epicureans, meanwhile, approached suffering with a pragmatic lens. They recognized that pain, whether physical or mental, limits the capacity to enjoy pleasure. Epicurus taught that the greatest good is the absence of pain, aponia, and that mental tranquility, ataraxia, comes from limiting desires to those that are natural and necessary. He warned against the pursuit of extravagant pleasures that inevitably led to greater pain. In his letter to Herodotus, he wrote, "When we say that a man lives a good life, we mean that he lives without pain and fear." For Epicurus, suffering is a natural limit that teaches us the value of moderation, a lesson that resonates with the Buddhist middle way, which also cautions against extremes of self-indulgence and self-mortification. Both traditions converge on the insight that the path to liberation lies not in the denial of all desire, but in the careful cultivation of desire that is aligned with reality. When we examine these ancient teachings side by side, patterns emerge that illuminate the evolution of philosophical thought on suffering. The Buddhist analysis of craving and ignorance anticipates the modern cognitive insight that many of our emotional pains stem from distorted beliefs, a premise central to cognitive behavioral therapy. The Hindu notion of karma, with its emphasis on ethical causality, prefigures contemporary discussions of moral responsibility and the long-term consequences of actions. Plato's allegory of the cave, with its emphasis on the painful ascent from illusion to truth, foreshadows the existentialist insistence that confronting the absurd is a necessary step toward authentic existence. Aristotle's view of pain as a moral teacher aligns with virtue ethics' focus on character formation through habituation. The Stoic dichotomy of control, echoed in modern mindfulness practices, reminds us that the locus of suffering often lies within our own judgments rather than external events. Even the skeptical and Epicurean counterarguments, which question the moral valence of suffering or treat it as a natural limit, enrich the conversation by highlighting the pluralism of perspectives that have always existed. Consider for a moment an analogy that bridges these traditions. Imagine suffering as a darkened room. In the Buddhist view, the darkness is the veil of ignorance, and the lamp of insight, realizing the impermanence of all things, illuminates the space, revealing that the objects within are not fixed but fluid. In the Hindu perspective, the darkness is the accumulated karma that clings to the soul, and the lamp is the realization of the self's unity with Brahman, which burns away the stains of past deeds. In the Platonic allegory, the darkness is the shadows on the cave wall, and the lamp is the sun of the forms, whose light reveals true reality. The Stoic lamp, meanwhile, is the rational mind that discerns what is within our control, casting light on the distinction between internal judgments and external events. The Epicurean lamp is the modest desire that keeps the room from being cluttered with unnecessary objects that block the light. The skeptic's candle, flickering uncertainly, reminds us that the very act of illumination may be questioned, yet the desire to see persists. Each tradition, then, offers a different kind of illumination, yet all agree that the darkness, suffering, can be mitigated through a form of insight. Historical anecdotes further bring these abstract ideas into lived experience. The Buddha's night beneath the Bodhi tree is not merely a story of personal enlightenment. It is a narrative that illustrates the methodical dismantling of suffering through direct observation of the mind's processes. He observed the breath, noted the arising and passing of thoughts, and recognized that craving was the knot that bound him to the cycle of rebirth. Similarly, Marcus Aurelius's meditations from the battlefield reveal a ruler who, despite the weight of empire and the immediacy of death, chooses to turn his attention inward to practice the Stoic art of reframing. He writes, "When you arise in the morning, think of the precious privilege it is to be alive, to breathe, to think, to enjoy, to love." In that moment, the external suffering of war is transformed into an internal gratitude, a shift that epitomizes the Stoic teaching that the mind can be a sanctuary, even in the midst of chaos. The cross references to later philosophical movements become evident when we trace the lineage from these ancient ideas to modern existential and phenomenological thought. Martin Heidegger in Being and Time speaks of thrownness, Duerfenheit, the fact that we find ourselves already situated in a world of suffering, anxiety, and finitude. He emphasizes that authentic existence arises when we confront this thrownness head-on, a stance that mirrors the Buddhist call to see dukkha directly rather than fleeing from it. Jean-Paul Sartre's assertion that existence precedes essence can be read alongside the Buddhist claim that there is no inherent self. Both deny a pre-given identity and instead locate meaning in the choices we make in the face of suffering. The phenomenologists focus on lived experience, on describing the texture of pain, the way it colors perception, resonates with the Buddhist practice of mindfulness, which trains the practitioner to observe suffering without judgment, thereby altering its impact. Even the Stoic emphasis on the rational appraisal of events anticipates modern cognitive therapies, where the goal is to identify and reframe maladaptive thoughts that amplify emotional pain. In the modern world, the ancient teachings find concrete applications. Consider a person grappling with chronic illness. The Buddhist approach would encourage mindfulness of the body, recognizing the impermanent nature of pain and seeing craving for a pain-free state as a source of additional suffering. By observing the sensations without attachment, the individual may reduce the mental amplification of the physical discomfort. The Stoic perspective would have them examine what lies within their control, their attitudes, their responses to treatment, their cultivation of inner virtues, while accepting the external reality of the disease. An Epicurean might advise the person to seek simple pleasures, perhaps the taste of a favorite tea, the companionship of a friend, to offset the pain, while avoiding the pursuit of grand ambitions that could exacerbate stress. A Hindu would view the illness as part of the individual's karmic journey, perhaps prompting practices of yoga and devotion that aim to purify the mind and accrue positive karma, ultimately moving toward moksha. Each tradition offers a toolbox for navigating suffering, and the modern individual can draw from this rich heritage to craft a personalized philosophy of resilience. To further illustrate, let us imagine two contemporary scenarios. First, a student facing the anxiety of an upcoming exam. The Buddhist teaches that the anxiety arises from craving for a perfect grade, for validation. By practicing breath awareness, the student can observe the anxiety as a passing mental event, reducing its grip. The Stoic would remind the student that the outcome of the exam is beyond their immediate control, but their study effort is within their power. Thus, they should focus on diligent preparation and accept the result with equanimity. The Epicurean would counsel the student to balance study with leisure, ensuring that the pursuit of academic success does not eclipse simple pleasures that sustain mental health. The Hindu perspective might frame the exam as an opportunity to perform one's dharma, fulfilling one's duty as a learner, while maintaining detachment from the fruits of the effort. Second, a community dealing with the aftermath of a natural disaster. The Buddhist concept of interdependence highlights that suffering is shared, compassion becomes the antidote. The community can practice loving-kindness meditation, extending goodwill to all affected, thereby transforming collective pain into collective care. The Stoic principle of focusing on what is within one's control, organizing relief, offering support, helps prevent paralysis by the enormity of the disaster. The Epicurean emphasis on simple, sustainable pleasures suggests that rebuilding can incorporate modest comforts, shared meals, communal storytelling that restore ataraxia. The Hindu view of karma may inspire the community to see the disaster as an opportunity for collective purification, encouraging rituals that foster spiritual resilience and a sense of purpose beyond material loss. These examples demonstrate that the ancient theories of suffering are not confined to ivory tower debates. They are living strategies that can be woven into the fabric of everyday life. They also reveal how each tradition, while offering distinct metaphysical foundations, converges on a practical aim: to transform the relationship between the individual and suffering, turning pain from a tyrannical master into a teacher, a guide, or even a doorway to deeper insight. The historical roots of suffering in ancient thought, therefore, form a mosaic of ideas that continue to inform our contemporary understanding. The Buddhist Four Noble Truths articulate a diagnostic framework, identifying the problem, its cause, its cessation, and the path forward, mirroring a modern therapeutic model of assessment, causation, treatment, and recovery. Hindu karma and moksha provide a moral causality that reminds us of the long-term consequences of our actions, a notion that resonates with current discussions about ethical responsibility and sustainability. Plato's allegory of the cave and Aristotle's virtue ethics embed suffering within the larger project of soul development, suggesting that pain can be a catalyst for growth rather than merely an obstacle. The Stoic dichotomy of control, embodied in the lived experiences of Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, offers a timeless technique for mental resilience that underlies many modern mindfulness and CBT practices. The skeptical and Epicurean counterarguments enrich the discourse by challenging the assumption that suffering must always be eradicated, instead proposing acceptance, moderation, and the recognition of pain's natural limits. Finally, as we trace these ancient threads forward, we see how they intertwine with the later existential and phenomenological currents that dominate modern philosophy of mind and ethics. The existentialists, confronting the absurdity of existence, echo the Buddhist acknowledgement of dukkha, yet they reject any transcendent escape, insisting that meaning must be forged in the face of suffering. Phenomenologists, by describing the lived texture of pain, echo the Buddhist practice of direct observation, while also resonating with the Stoic emphasis on the subjective appraisal of events. Even contemporary neuroscience, mapping the brain's pain pathways, finds philosophical allies in the ancient claim that suffering is not merely a physical signal but a mental interpretation, a view that both the Buddha and the Stoics would recognize. In this vast panorama of thought, the ancient philosophers did not merely catalog suffering. They offered maps, lanterns, and tools for navigating its terrain. Their stories of a prince under a bodhi tree, of an emperor scribbling in the mud of a battlefield, of a skeptic wandering the courts of Alexander, remain vivid reminders that suffering is a universal human experience, but also a universal opportunity for insight. As we continue to explore the philosophy of suffering, let us carry these ancient lights forward, allowing them to illuminate the modern corridors of our own minds, and perhaps, in doing so, transform the very nature of the pain that has accompanied us since the dawn of consciousness. The story of suffering in the medieval world is a tapestry woven from threads of faith, philosophy, and the lived experience of those who walked the narrow paths between heaven and earth. It is a story that asks us in a quiet voice what it means to bear pain, to find meaning in loss, and to transform a wound into a window onto the divine. As we move through the medieval centuries, we encounter Christian, Islamic, and Jewish thinkers who each framed suffering in ways that echo ancient Stoicism, yet also diverge sharply, reaching toward a vision of redemption that is uniquely their own. Consider first the Christian imagination, where the very heart of suffering is bound up with the figure of Christ on the cross. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the 4th and early 5th centuries, offers a paradox that would reverberate through the ages. The felix culpa, the happy fault. Augustine reflects on the fall of man not merely as a tragedy, but as a providential misstep that opened the door to a greater good. He writes, "For what is more marvelous than that the sin of Adam, which seemed a loss, turned out to be a gain, because through it God could bring forth the incarnation, the redemption, and the hope of eternal life." In this view, suffering is not an end in itself, but a conduit through which divine love can be more fully expressed. The Passion narrative provides the concrete illustration of this theological principle. The suffering of Jesus, his bruised hands, his crown of thorns, the nails that pierced his flesh, becomes, for Augustine, the ultimate example of redemptive suffering. He asks gently, if the Son of God could endure such agony for the sake of humanity, might our own small pains be seen as participation in that grand mystery? Augustine's answer is both comforting and demanding. Our suffering, when offered in love, can be united with Christ's, becoming a sacrificial offering that participates in the healing of the world. Thomas Aquinas, writing centuries later, brings a different intellectual flavor to this conversation. He inherits the Aristotelian framework of virtue, courage, temperance, justice, and integrates it with the Christian theodicy. Aquinas argues that suffering, when ordered toward a greater good, is not contrary to the nature of God, who is the ultimate good. In his Summa Theologica he writes, all that happens in the world, even the evil, is directed toward the ultimate good, which is the perfection of the divine plan. For Aquinas, the virtue of fortitude is the means by which we respond to suffering, not by denying it, but by embracing it as a trial that refines the soul. He distinguishes between suffering that is gratuitous, pain without purpose, and suffering that is instrumental, a test that shapes character. In this way, Aquinas creates a bridge between the ancient Stoic acceptance of fate and the Christian call to transform suffering into a moral good. The medieval Christian mystics bring this abstract theology down to the lived body. Hildegard of Bingen, a 13th century abbess, composer, and visionary, offers a vivid anecdote that illustrates how illness could become a portal to the divine. Hildegard fell gravely ill in her early 20s, suffering fever, delirium, and visions that would later fill her prophetic writings. She describes her experience in the Civias, saying, "My body was a furnace, my mind a storm, yet in the midst of this fire I heard the voice of the Almighty, saying, 'Do not fear, my child. Your suffering is a ladder to the heights of my kingdom.'" Hildegard's illness was not merely a personal trial, it was a crucible that forged a new mode of theological insight. Her visions, born of pain, gave her a language to speak of the divine that would influence generations of mystics and theologians. Another emblematic figure is Saint Francis of Assisi, whose radical embrace of poverty and bodily hardship offers a living illustration of redemptive suffering. In the early 13th century, Francis renounced his wealth, chose to live among lepers, and subjected himself to physical austerities, fasting, self-flagellation, and the bearing of a simple wooden cross. He famously said, "All the world is my brother, and I am bound to bear his pain as my own." When he received the stigmata, the wounds of Christ appeared on his own body, a physical manifestation of his desire to share in the Passion. Francis's life becomes a narrative of suffering not as a punishment, but as a means of entering into deeper communion with the divine, a theme that resonates throughout the medieval Christian imagination. Turning now to the Islamic tradition, we encounter a different yet complementary perspective on pain. Al-Ghazali, the great Persian theologian and mystic of the 11th century, writes in his Ihya, Ulam al-Din, that pain is a reminder of God, a subtle whisper that draws the heart back toward its source. He states, when the soul feels the sting of hardship, it awakens from its slumber and remembers the one who created it. For Al-Ghazali, suffering is a catalyst for spiritual awakening, a signpost pointing the believer toward the divine presence that underlies all existence. This view aligns with the Sufi notion of the pains of love, where the lover's yearning and the ache of separation become the fuel for mystical ascent. The Sufi poet Rumi captures this sentiment when he writes, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." In this poetic metaphor, pain is not merely a negative force. It is the opening through which divine illumination can flow. The Sufi tradition also offers a rich tapestry of stories that illustrate the transformative power of suffering. The tale of the mystic Mansur al-Haytami, who endured imprisonment and physical torment, yet reported visions of the divine light that intensified during his hardships, serves as a powerful example. His experience underscores a central Sufi claim, that the deeper the lover's yearning, the closer they draw to the beloved. This dynamic mirrors Augustine's Felix Culpa, yet it emerges from a distinct theological and cultural context, showing how the motif of redemptive suffering transcends religious boundaries. Jewish thought, particularly in its mystical branch, adds another layer to the medieval discourse on suffering. The Kabbalistic concept of tikkun, repair, frames pain as a necessary process of cosmic restoration. In the Zohar, the foundational text of Kabbalah, the suffering of the righteous is described as the sparks of divine light that have fallen into the material world, awaiting uplift through the acts of the faithful. The Kabbalist Isaac Luria the Ari elaborated on this by teaching that each act of piety, each moment of endurance, helps to gather these scattered sparks and restore harmony to creation. He writes, when the soul bears the weight of suffering, it draws down the hidden light, sealing the breach that sin has created. In this view, suffering is not merely a personal trial but a cosmic responsibility, a participation in the ongoing repair of the universe. The medieval Jewish philosopher Maimonides, while not a mystic, also grapples with the problem of suffering. He argues that the existence of pain serves a pedagogical function, shaping moral character and encouraging humility before the divine. Yet he remains aware of the tension this creates with the notion of a benevolent God, a tension that would be echoed in later critiques. To deepen our understanding, we must also hear the voices of those who challenged these comforting narratives. Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, a 12th century Andalusian philosopher, raised a formidable objection to the idea that suffering could be wholly redemptive. Drawing on Aristotelian metaphysics, he argued that the existence of gratuitous evil, pain that serves no apparent purpose, poses a serious problem for any theodicy that claims all suffering is ultimately good. He writes, if God is the cause of all that exists, then the presence of pain without a higher purpose calls into question the very nature of divine wisdom. Ibn Rushd's critique forces us to confront the possibility that some suffering may be inexplicable, that the divine may operate beyond human comprehension, a theme that resonates with the later existentialist reflections of modern philosophy. Within the Christian tradition, the medieval skeptic John of Salisbury offers a parallel challenge. In his Polycraticus, he questions the adequacy of the Augustinian solution, asking, if the fall of Adam brings about a greater good, does this not render the original sin a necessary evil? And if evil is necessary, can we truly call it evil at all? John's probing doubts echo the Stoic insistence on rational consistency and the Buddhist emphasis on seeing reality as it is, without the overlay of metaphysical justification. His skepticism invites a more nuanced view, one that acknowledges the limits of human reasoning when faced with the mystery of suffering. When we compare these medieval perspectives with ancient Stoicism, we see both continuity and divergence. The Stoics, from Zeno to Seneca, taught that suffering arises from the misalignment between our expectations and the external world, and that by cultivating inner virtue we can achieve a state of apatheia, freedom from destructive passions. This resonates with Aquinas' virtue ethics, where fortitude steadies the soul against pain. Yet the Stoic ideal often leans toward an impersonal rational order, whereas the medieval Christian, Islamic, and Jewish thinkers embed suffering within a relational framework of love, divine purpose, and cosmic repair. The Stoic sage might view pain as indifferent, a neutral event to be accepted, while Augustine would see the same pain as a possible conduit for divine grace. Buddhist acceptance of suffering, articulated in the Four Noble Truths, also offers a point of comparison. Buddhism diagnoses suffering dukkha as an inherent aspect of conditioned existence, caused by craving, and proposes a path, the Noble Eightfold Path, to its cessation. The Buddhist approach differs from the medieval Christian notion of redemptive suffering, which often embraces pain as a means to a higher end. Yet there is a subtle parallel in the Sufi concept of the pains of love, where longing and yearning become the catalyst for spiritual liberation, much as Buddhist mindfulness transforms suffering into insight. Both traditions, though distinct, recognize that pain can be a doorway, not merely an obstacle. Let us return to concrete examples that illustrate how these ideas played out in lived history. Hildegard of Bingen's visions, as mentioned earlier, were recorded in vivid poetic language. She describes a celestial choir singing, "All the suffering of the world is gathered in my heart, and I become a vessel for the Holy Spirit." Her illness, far from silencing her, amplified her voice, allowing her to articulate a theology where the body's afflictions become the soil in which divine revelation can take root. Her experience underscores a key medieval insight, that the boundary between the physical and the spiritual is porous, and that suffering can be a bridge rather than a wall. St. Francis's encounter with leprosy offers another striking illustration. Legend tells that when Francis entered the leper colony of San Damiano, he embraced the outcast, saying, "I am a leper, and I shall be a leper for all the world." He took on the physical pain of disease not as a martyrdom, but as an act of solidarity with Christ's own suffering. This radical identification with the afflicted reshaped the Christian understanding of poverty and pain, inspiring the Franciscan order's emphasis on humility and service. Francis's life demonstrates how suffering can be transformed into a lived theology, a daily practice that reflects the belief that pain, when embraced in love, becomes a conduit for divine grace. In the Islamic world, the story of the Persian mystic Rabia al-Adawiyya, though earlier than al-Ghazali, offers a poignant example of suffering as love. Rabia, living in the 9th century, endured poverty, illness, and social marginalization, yet she proclaimed, "I love God for his own sake, not for the promise of paradise." Her suffering was not a means to an end, but an expression of an ecstatic love that transcended worldly concerns. Al-Ghazali later echoed this sentiment, insisting that pain is a reminder of God's presence, a call to return to the source. From the Jewish mystical tradition, the tale of the 12th century Kabbalist Abraham Abulafia provides an illustration of suffering as tikkun. Abulafia practiced intense meditation techniques, often inducing physical strain and emotional turmoil, in order to achieve prophetic illumination. He wrote, "Through the burning of the soul, the divine spark is drawn upward, repairing the cracks in the heavens." His personal hardships, endured in the pursuit of mystical union, embody the Kabbalistic belief that suffering can serve the larger cosmic repair. These narratives, anecdotes, and theological reflections converge on a central question: what is the purpose, if any, of suffering? The medieval thinkers we have surveyed offer a spectrum of answers, from Augustine's happy fault to Al-Ghazali's reminder, from Aquinas' virtue ethics to the Kabbalistic tikkun. Yet the counterarguments of Ibn Rushd and John of Salisbury remind us that any answer must grapple with the reality of gratuitous pain. Their critiques do not merely negate the possibility of meaning. They sharpen the inquiry, urging us to consider that meaning may be partial, provisional, or even paradoxical. In reflecting on these medieval perspectives, we might ask ourselves, how do they speak to our contemporary experience of suffering? In a world where pain can be both physical illness, loss, trauma, and existential alienation, meaninglessness, the medieval frameworks offer resources for reimagining pain. The idea that suffering can be a participatory act, a shared communion with a larger narrative, can provide solace. The notion that pain can be a reminder of something beyond ourselves, a divine presence, a cosmic order, offers a way to locate meaning beyond the immediate. At the same time, the modern skeptic's voice remains vital. We must acknowledge that not all suffering can be neatly woven into a story of redemption. The random, brutal tragedies that strike without apparent purpose challenge any theological system that seeks to universalize meaning. Here, the Stoic practice of accepting the limits of control and the Buddhist practice of mindful observation can complement the medieval emphasis on love and purpose. By integrating these traditions, we might cultivate a more holistic approach, one that honors the possibility of meaning while also holding space for mystery and ambiguity. To bring these ideas into a concrete modern context, consider the experience of a caregiver for a loved one with a terminal illness. The caregiver endures sleepless nights, emotional exhaustion, and physical strain. In a medieval Christian frame, this caregiver might view their suffering as a participation in Christ's own bearing of the cross, offering prayers that unite their pain with the passion. In an Islamic Sufi lens, the caregiver could see the pain as a reminder of God's presence, a call to deepen their love for the divine through self-sacrifice. From a Kabbalistic perspective, the caregiver's endurance might be understood as gathering scattered sparks of divine light, contributing to the repair of the world. Yet the skeptic's voice would remind the caregiver that the suffering may be senseless, urging them to seek practical support, to set boundaries, and to recognize the limits of any theological explanation. Another example lies in the realm of social justice activism. Those who march for climate justice, who protest against oppression, often endure arrest, injury, and social ostracism. Their suffering can be framed, through the lens of Augustine's Felix Culpa, as a necessary fault that awakens a higher consciousness in society, a collective redemption. Aquinas' virtue ethics would cast their fortitude as a moral virtue, a cultivated strength that refines character. The Sufi notion of the pains of love might see their activism as an expression of divine love for creation, where the ache of injustice fuels the fire of compassion. Yet the rationalist critique of Ibn Rushd would caution against assuming that all suffering serves a divine plan, urging a careful analysis of cause and effect, and a focus on concrete change rather than theological justification. In weaving together these threads, we see that medieval theological dimensions of suffering are not static doctrines, but living conversations that continue to shape how we understand pain today. The cross-referencing of Augustine, Aquinas, Al-Ghazali, the Sufis, and the Kabbalists reveals a rich dialogue across cultures and centuries, each tradition borrowing, adapting, and sometimes contesting the ideas of the others. Augustine's happy fault finds a resonance in the Sufis' ecstatic love, Aquinas' virtue ethics converses with Stoic rationality, the Kabbalistic tikkun dialogues with Buddhist notions of interdependence and the repair of suffering. The medieval period, far from being a monolithic era of dogma, was a crucible of ideas where philosophers, mystics, and skeptics engaged in a dynamic exchange. Their reflections on suffering were informed by the social realities of plague, crusades, and the rise of universities, yet they also reached toward the timeless questions that still haunt us. As we listen to the echoes of their voices, Augustine's gentle paradox, Aquinas' measured logic, Al-Ghazali's heartfelt reminder, the Sufi's poetic ache, the Kabbalist's cosmic repair, we are invited to contemplate our own relationship to pain. Are we, like Hildegard, able to turn personal illness into a source of insight? Do we, like St. Francis, embrace simplicity and hardship as a path to deeper love? Or do we, like Ibn Rushd, remain vigilant, questioning the adequacy of any grand narrative that seeks to explain the inexplicable? The answer may not be singular nor final. Perhaps the medieval tradition teaches us that suffering can be many things at once: a test, a gift, a mystery, a wound, and a doorway. It may be a catalyst for virtue, a reminder of the divine, a means of cosmic repair, or simply an event that challenges us to confront the limits of our understanding. In the quiet moments of reflection, we might hear the ancient Stoic whisper that the obstacle is the way, the Buddhist murmur that suffering is the teacher, and the medieval echo that through pain we draw nearer to the heart of God. As we close this exploration, let us hold these diverse perspectives together, like threads in a tapestry, each contributing its color and texture. In the end, the medieval theological dimensions of suffering invite us not only to answer the question of why we suffer, but also to consider how we will respond. Will we seek meaning in the midst of pain, as Augustine and the Sufis suggest? Will we cultivate virtue and fortitude, as Aquinas advises? Will we engage in the cosmic task of tikkun, as the Kabbalists propose? Or will we, like the skeptic, acknowledge the limits of our narratives and remain open to the mystery that surrounds every wound? The choice, perhaps, lies within the very heart of suffering itself, a place where philosophy, theology, and lived experience converge, inviting us to walk, step by step, toward a deeper understanding of what it means to be human in a world that is both fragile and wondrous. The story of suffering, as it unfolds in modern philosophy, is not a simple narrative of pain alone, but a tapestry woven from the threads of freedom, meaning, embodiment, and ethical responsibility. In the 19th and 20th centuries, thinkers such as Soren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche, Martin Heidegger, and Maurice Merleau-Ponty each offered a distinct lens through which to view the experience of anguish. And each lens continues to shape how we understand the lives of a burned-out executive, a veteran haunted by the echo of gunfire, and the countless patients whose bodies bear the marks of chronic pain. To follow this journey, we must first locate the origins of these ideas, then trace the arguments that arise from them, consider the counter-voices of Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre, and finally bring the discussion into the concrete ethical terrain of contemporary bioethics, pain management, palliative care, and the question of euthanasia. Kierkegaard's Sickness unto Death begins, as many of his writings do, with a striking paradox. Despair is the sickness unto death, a condition of the self that cannot be cured by any medical remedy. In his 1849 work, he insists that the self is a synthesis of the finite and the infinite, the temporal and the eternal, and that suffering arises when this synthesis collapses under the weight of unacknowledged freedom. He writes, "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom," a phrase that captures the unsettling vertigo felt when the individual recognizes that every choice opens a horizon of possibilities, each accompanied by the risk of loss, failure, or meaninglessness. For Kierkegaard, suffering is not merely an external affliction but an inner condition, a spiritual anxiety that signals the self's awareness of its own finitude and its yearning for the infinite. The historical anecdote of Kierkegaard's own life illustrates this intimately. In 1841, he broke off his engagement to Regine Olsen, a decision that plunged him into a prolonged period of melancholy and self-exile. He later reflected that his sickness was not a disease of the body but a disease of the spirit, a condition that forced him to confront the paradox of loving someone while simultaneously refusing to be bound by that love. This personal crisis became the crucible for his philosophical insights, and it demonstrates how his abstract analysis of despair was rooted in lived experience. Nietzsche, writing a few decades later, turns Kierkegaard's anxiety on its head. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he proclaims, "What does not kill me makes me stronger," and in Beyond Good and Evil, he argues that suffering is the crucible in which the will to power is forged. For Nietzsche, the suffering of the individual is not a sign of weakness or a call for rescue, but a necessary catalyst for the emergence of the Übermensch, the higher type who creates new values in the face of a world that has already declared the death of God. He famously declares, "One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star." Suffering, in this view, is the chaotic substrate from which the creative self can rise. A vivid historical anecdote underscores Nietzsche's conviction. In 1889, while residing in Turin, Nietzsche suffered a mental collapse that left him unable to write or speak coherently for the remainder of his life. Yet even in his final, fragmented utterances, he clung to the idea that the greatest weight, the endless recurrence of suffering, could be embraced as a test of one's affirmation of life. His own personal torment then becomes a living illustration of his claim that suffering is not merely to be endured, but to be transformed into a source of strength. Heidegger, moving into the 20th century, reframes the discussion of suffering through the concept of being toward death. In Being and Time, he argues that human existence, Dasein, is fundamentally oriented toward its own finitude. He writes, "Death is the possibility of the most authentic existence. The anxiety that arises from this anticipation is not a pathological condition, but an existential disclosure of the limits that shape our possibilities." When Dasein confronts its mortality, the ordinary distractions of everyday life fall away, revealing the rawness of existence itself. Suffering, then, is the lived expression of this confrontation, a moment when the veil of the everyday lifts, exposing the individual to the stark reality of being finite. Heidegger's own life offers a poignant anecdote. During the early 1930s, as he returned to Freiburg after a period of political entanglement, he found himself confronting the silence of the Black Forest, a landscape that seemed to echo the emptiness of his own philosophical pursuits. He described this period as one of the silence of the woods, a time when the weight of his own mortality pressed upon him, and he turned inward, writing about the being of being in a way that was as much a personal reckoning with death as an academic treatise. This retreat into the forest illustrates how his abstract notion of being toward death was rooted in an embodied sensory encounter with the world. Merleau-Ponty, a leading phenomenologist, brings the body to the fore. In Phenomenology of Perception, he insists that the lived body is the primary medium through which we experience pain and suffering. He writes, "The body is our general medium for having a world." Pain, for Merleau-Ponty, is not a mere signal transmitted to the brain, but an embodied perception that shapes our relationship to the world. The suffering of the body is inseparable from the suffering of the mind. The two co-constitute the lived experience of anguish. A concrete illustration of Merleau-Ponty's insight can be found in the wartime injury he sustained during World War I. While serving as a stretcher-bearer, he was wounded in the leg, an injury that left him with a permanent limp. He later reflected that the pain of his wound taught him that the world is not a collection of objects but a field of lived experience, a horizon of possibilities that is always already felt. His own bodily suffering informed his philosophical claim that perception is always already embodied, and that the lived body is the site where meaning and pain intersect. Having outlined the central contributions of these four thinkers, we can now examine how their ideas converge and diverge when applied to real-world scenarios. Consider first the modern professional, a senior manager at a multinational corporation, perhaps, who finds himself in the grip of burnout. His days are filled with endless meetings, performance metrics, and the pressure to deliver results in an increasingly volatile market. He experiences a persistent sense of anxiety that mirrors Kierkegaard's dizziness of freedom. He is free to choose his career path, yet every decision seems to tighten the knot of expectation, leading to a despair that feels both personal and universal. He might ask himself, am I living authentically, or have I become a mere function of corporate demands? In this moment, the existential angst that Kierkegaard describes becomes a palpable, occupational suffering. The professional's body, too, shows signs. Chronic headaches, insomnia, a tightening chest, signs that Merleau-Ponty would interpret as the body's way of communicating the dissonance between the self and its environment. Now turn to a veteran returning from combat, haunted by the flash of artillery and the scream of distant mortars. He suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition that brings intrusive memories, hypervigilance, and an unrelenting sense of dread. For him, Nietzsche's affirmation of suffering as a source of strength may feel alien. Yet some veterans find, through therapy and community, a way to transform their trauma into a catalyst for advocacy, thereby embodying Nietzsche's claim that one must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. Heidegger's notion of being toward death also resonates. The veteran's confrontation with mortality on the battlefield forces a reckoning with the finitude of life, and the subsequent suffering becomes a doorway to an authentic engagement with existence. The veteran's embodied experience of pain, both psychological and somatic, aligns with Merleau-Ponty's claim that the body is the medium through which the world is perceived, and the world for the veteran is now saturated with the memory of combat. These two examples illustrate how the philosophical concepts of suffering are not confined to ivory tower debates, but are lived in boardrooms, on battlefields, and within the quiet moments of personal reflection. They also reveal the need for a nuanced ethical response. In contemporary bioethics, the question of how to alleviate suffering without undermining the very conditions that give it meaning is hotly contested. Pain management, for instance, is caught between the imperative to relieve suffering and the concern that overmedication might dull the existential awareness that Kierkegaard deems essential for authentic self-formation. As a result, some ethicists argue for responsible palliative care, a practice that seeks to balance the relief of physical pain with the preservation of the patient's capacity for meaning-making. In this context, the philosopher's insight becomes a policy tool. If suffering can be a source of existential insight, then perhaps the goal is not total eradication, but rather the transformation of pain into a space for reflection. The debate over euthanasia further illustrates this tension. Proponents often invoke a compassionate ethic that prioritizes the cessation of unbearable suffering, while opponents, drawing on Kierkegaard's and Heidegger's ideas, warn that the decision to end one's life may truncate the authentic engagement with mortality that gives life its depth. Camus the absurdist offers a stark counterpoint. In the myth of Sisyphus, he declares, there is no fate that does not bring suffering, and yet the absurd hero must imagine Sisyphus happy. Camus sees suffering as an inevitable, meaningless backdrop against which we must create our own meaning. He argues that the recognition of absurdity does not justify suicide, rather it calls for a revolt, a conscious decision to live in spite of the void. This perspective challenges both the Kierkegaardian notion of despair as a gateway to authenticity and the Nietzschean affirmation of suffering as a path to greatness. Sartre, meanwhile, offers yet another angle. In existentialism is a humanism, he asserts. Man is condemned to be free. He is responsible for everything he makes. For Sartre, freedom is not merely the source of anxiety, but also its antidote. He suggests that suffering can be transcended through the exercise of radical freedom, by choosing one's attitude toward pain, by refusing to be defined by it. He famously writes, "Freedom is what we are, what we do, what we become." In the case of the burned-out executive, Sartre would argue that the individual can reclaim agency by redefining the meaning of work, perhaps by shifting from a profit-driven identity to one of mentorship or social impact. For the veteran, Sartre would point to the possibility of choosing a narrative of survivorship rather than victimhood, thereby exercising freedom even in the face of trauma. Both Camus and Sartre thus serve as counter-arguments to the earlier thinkers, but they do not merely negate the previous claims, they extend the conversation. Camus' absurdist lens emphasizes the lack of inherent meaning, prompting us to ask whether suffering itself needs to be justified at all. Sartre's emphasis on freedom invites us to consider agency even when external conditions seem oppressive. In bioethical deliberations, these perspectives can inform policies that respect patient autonomy while acknowledging the existential dimensions of suffering. For instance, a patient's request for assisted dying may be understood not only as a desire to escape pain, but also as an existential choice, a Sartrean exercise of freedom. Conversely, a Camus-inspired approach might caution against interpreting suffering as a problem to be solved, instead encouraging societies to create spaces where individuals can confront the absurd and find solidarity. To deepen the analysis, we can cross-reference these ideas with other philosophical traditions. Levinas, for example, emphasizes the ethical responsibility to the other, suggesting that the face-to-face encounter with another's suffering calls us to an infinite responsibility. This adds an ethical dimension to Kierkegaard's anxiety. The self's despair is not only inward-looking but also outward-directed, compelling us to respond to the suffering of others. Foucault's genealogy of power and knowledge can be applied to the medicalization of pain, revealing how institutions shape our understanding of suffering, often turning it into a problem to be managed rather than a lived experience to be interpreted. Wittgenstein's later philosophy of language reminds us that the way we talk about pain, through metaphors, narratives, and shared forms of life, shapes how we experience it. These cross-references broaden the conversation, showing that suffering is not only a philosophical problem, but also a linguistic, social, and ethical one. Returning to the phenomenological account of the lived body, Merleau-Ponty's insight can be illustrated through a simple analogy. Imagine the body as a musical instrument and pain as a dissonant chord that reverberates through the entire composition of life. The chord is not isolated, it interacts with every other note, altering the melody, the rhythm, the timbre. In the same way, a chronic illness does not merely affect a single organ, it reshapes the person's perception of time, relationships, and possibilities. This analogy helps us grasp why Merleau-Ponty insists that we cannot reduce pain to a purely physiological signal. We must attend to its musical, relational, and existential resonances. A second analogy draws on the image of a ship in a storm. The ship ourself faces turbulent waves of anxiety, loss, and physical pain. Kierkegaard would say the storm reveals the ship's true design, its capacity to navigate freedom and despair. Nietzsche would argue that the storm is the crucible that forges a stronger hull, a ship capable of sailing into uncharted seas. Heidegger would note that the storm reminds the ship of its ultimate destination, its own termination at the horizon. Merleau-Ponty would remind us that the ship's hull is not a detached container but part of the sea itself. The waves of pain are felt through the hull, shaping the ship's movement. Camus would suggest that the storm is absurd, a random occurrence without purpose, yet the crew must still row, finding meaning in the act itself. Sartre would proclaim that even amidst the storm, the crew retains the freedom to choose how to respond, whether to surrender to the waves or to steer defiantly toward a new shore. These analogies, coupled with the historical anecdotes of Kierkegaard's broken engagement, Nietzsche's mental collapse, Heidegger's silent walks in the Black Forest, and Merleau-Ponty's wartime wound, illustrate how personal crisis becomes philosophical insight. They also remind us that suffering, while deeply personal, is historically situated. The 19th century existentialists wrote in a world undergoing rapid industrialization, scientific upheaval, and the erosion of religious certainty. The 20th century phenomenologists responded to the trauma of two world wars, the rise of existential nihilism, and the growing alienation of the modern individual. Their ideas continue to reverberate because the conditions that generate suffering, uncertainty, finitude, embodied vulnerability, remain central to the human condition. In contemporary practice, these philosophical insights find expression in therapeutic approaches such as existential psychotherapy, which draws directly on Kierkegaard, Heidegger, and Sartre to help patients confront the anxiety of freedom and the inevitability of death. Therapists encourage clients to explore the meaning of their suffering, to view it as an opportunity for authentic self-creation rather than merely a symptom to be eliminated. In the realm of pain management, clinicians are increasingly aware of the biopsychosocial model, which integrates the physiological, psychological, and social dimensions of suffering, a model that echoes Merleau-Ponty's embodiment thesis. The model acknowledges that a patient's cultural narrative about pain, their personal history of trauma, and their social support network all shape the lived experience of suffering. The debate over euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide illustrates the ethical stakes of these philosophical positions. In jurisdictions where euthanasia is legal, such as the Netherlands and Canada, the law often requires that the patient's suffering be unbearable and without prospect of improvement. Yet what counts as unbearable is a deeply subjective judgment, informed by the patient's existential orientation. A Kierkegaardian might argue that the patient's despair reflects a failure to confront the sickness unto death, and that alleviating it too quickly could foreclose the possibility of authentic transformation. A Nietzschean might contend that the patient's choice to end their life is an affirmation of their own will to power, a decisive act of self-overcoming. A Camus-inspired perspective would caution that the decision may be a surrender to the absurd, while a Sartrean view would emphasize the patient's radical freedom to decide, provided that the choice is made without coercion. These conflicting interpretations highlight why bioethical policies must be flexible enough to accommodate multiple philosophical frameworks. One proposal gaining traction is the concept of narrative euthanasia, where physicians engage patients in deep conversations about their life story, values, and the meaning they ascribe to their suffering before making any decision. This approach mirrors the existentialist insistence on authenticity and the phenomenological emphasis on lived experience. It also respects the Camusian call to confront absurdity head-on, allowing the patient to decide whether to continue the struggle or to embrace the final act as a form of existential freedom. The modern discourse on suffering also intersects with emerging technologies. Advances in neuropharmacology and brain-computer interfaces promise new ways to modulate pain, but they also raise questions about the alteration of the lived body. If we can turn down the volume of pain through a neural implant, what becomes of the embodied perception that Merleau-Ponty insists is central to our being? Might we lose the capacity to feel the world in its fullness, reducing our existence to a sanitized, pain-free simulation? Heidegger would warn that such technological enframing threatens to obscure the being toward death that gives our lives urgency. Nietzsche might argue that the removal of suffering could diminish the crucible that forges greatness, leading to a cultural stagnation. Conversely, Camus might suggest that the removal of pain could free humanity to confront the absurd without the distraction of bodily distress, thereby opening new avenues for creative revolt. In sum, the modern philosophical analyses of suffering, through the lenses of existentialism, phenomenology, and ethics, offer a rich, multifaceted portrait of why we hurt, how we interpret that hurt, and what we might do about it. Kierkegaard reminds us that anxiety is the price of freedom, that despair can be a doorway to authenticity. Nietzsche challenges us to see suffering as the fertile ground from which higher values emerge. Heidegger brings death into the conversation, showing that the awareness of our finitude shapes every experience of pain. Merleau-Ponty grounds the discussion in the lived body, insisting that perception and embodiment are inseparable from suffering. Camus and Sartre provide powerful counter-arguments, urging us either to embrace the absurd without recourse to escape, or to exercise radical freedom in the face of pain. The ethical implications ripple outward, influencing how we manage pain, how we respect autonomy in end-of-life decisions, and how we design technologies that might alter the very texture of human suffering. As we reflect on these ideas, consider the following question. When we encounter a colleague who is visibly exhausted, when we hear a veteran describing the nightmarish replay of combat, when we sit beside a patient whose eyes plead for relief, what philosophical stance will guide our response? Will we see suffering as a call to alleviate at all costs, as a symptom to be eradicated? Or will we recognize it as a profound, albeit painful, invitation to confront the depths of our own freedom, to reevaluate what it means to be alive, to bear witness to the fragile, embodied reality that defines us? The answer may not be a single doctrine but a conversation, a dialogue among Kierkegaard's despair, Nietzsche's affirmation, Heidegger's finitude, Merleau-Ponty's embodiment, Camus's absurd, and Sartre's freedom. In that dialogue lies the possibility of a more humane, thoughtful approach to suffering, one that honors both the pain and the potential for meaning that resides within it. When we speak of suffering, we often imagine a raw, unmediated pain that simply exists, as if it were a stone lodged in the flesh of the world. Yet the story of that stone is far more intricate than the surface suggests. It is a story that weaves together ancient philosophical reflections, the latest discoveries of neuroscience, and the lived testimonies of those who have walked through the darkest valleys of human experience. In this segment, we will trace that tapestry, moving from the biopsychosocial model of pain to the plasticity of the brain, from the placebo effect that quietly overturns the old mind-body split, to Viktor Frankl's logotherapy that insists meaning can be found even in the most brutal of circumstances. We will pause to listen to the voices of Holocaust survivors, to feel the breath of mindfulness-based stress reduction rooted in Buddhist insight, and to follow the gentle reframing of cognitive behavioral therapy for chronic illness. And we will not shy away from the dissenting voices, the radical physicalists who claim pain carries no intrinsic meaning, and the anti-psychiatry critics like Thomas Schass who warn us against turning every sorrow into a medical diagnosis. Throughout, we will hear echoes of the Stoic practice of premeditatio malorum, and we will glimpse how modern resilience research is, in many ways, a scientific echo of that ancient exercise. Let us begin with the foundation that contemporary health professionals use to understand why we suffer, the biopsychosocial model. This model, first articulated by George Engel in the 1970s, invites us to view pain not as a single, isolated event, but as a dynamic interaction among biological, psychological, and social dimensions. Imagine a three-layered tapestry. The biological thread is the nervous system, the inflammatory mediators, the genetic predispositions that shape how a nociceptor fires. The psychological thread is our attention, our expectations, our memories of past hurts, and the meanings we assign to the sensation. The social thread is the cultural narrative, the support, or lack thereof, of family and community, the language we use to describe pain. When any one of these threads is tugged, the whole pattern shifts. A simple cut on the finger may heal quickly if the body's tissues are healthy, the mind is calm, and the social environment offers reassurance. The same cut can become a chronic wound if inflammation persists, if anxiety amplifies the signal, and if isolation removes the soothing voice of a caregiver. Neuroscience has begun to illuminate how these three layers converse at the level of circuitry. The dorsal horn of the spinal cord, once thought to be a mere relay station, now appears as a gatekeeper, modulating signals based on descending inputs from the brain. The periaqueductal gray, the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, all these regions form a network that can either amplify or dampen the pain experience. In the 1990s, researchers such as Melzack and Wall introduced the gate control theory, suggesting that non-painful stimuli could close the gate to painful input. Decades later, functional MRI studies have shown that when a person expects relief, perhaps because they have been told a medication will work, brain regions associated with reward and expectation, like the nucleus accumbens, become active, and the pain signal itself diminishes. This is not merely a metaphor, it is a measurable reduction in neural activity that correlates with the subjective report of less pain. Here we encounter the placebo effect, a phenomenon that has long haunted the mind-body dualism inherited from Descartes. The classic story of a patient receiving a sugar pill, yet reporting genuine relief, seems to vindicate the idea that the mind can, by sheer will, alter the body. Modern studies have taken this anecdote and turned it into a rigorous experimental paradigm. In one landmark trial, participants were given an inert cream, but were told it was a potent analgesic. Brain scans revealed that the expectation of relief activated the same endogenous opioid pathways that are triggered by actual morphine. The placebo, therefore, is not a trick of imagination. It is a real neurochemical cascade that demonstrates the brain's capacity to rewire its own experience of pain. This challenges the rigid separation of mind and body, suggesting instead a fluid, reciprocal relationship where beliefs, emotions, and neural chemistry co-construct what we call suffering. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize its connections in response to experience, extends this insight further. Chronic pain is no longer seen merely as a symptom of tissue damage, but as a learned pattern of neural activity that can become entrenched. Studies of patients with long-standing back pain have shown that the somatosensory cortex, normally devoted to mapping the body's surface, undergoes a reallocation of space, with regions that once represented the lower back shrinking, while adjacent areas expand to fill the gap. This maladaptive plasticity can perpetuate pain even after the original injury has healed. Yet the same principle works in reverse. Through targeted interventions, mindfulness meditation, graded exposure, cognitive restructuring, the brain can be guided to form new, healthier pathways. The very fact that the brain can unlearn pain is both hopeful and philosophically profound. It tells us that suffering is not a fixed destiny, but a dynamic process that we, at least in part, co-author. Turning now to Viktor Frankl, we encounter a voice that bridges existential philosophy and clinical practice. Frankl, a neurologist and psychiatrist, survived the horrors of Auschwitz and emerged with a conviction that even the most extreme suffering can become a gateway to meaning. In his seminal work, Man's Search for Meaning, he writes, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." This aphorism is not a hollow platitude. It is a call to reorient our relationship to pain. Frankl's logotherapy posits that humans are driven not merely by the pursuit of pleasure or the avoidance of pain, but by a deeper will to meaning. When faced with inevitable suffering, the individual can discover purpose through three avenues: creating a work or deed, experiencing something or encountering someone of value, and adopting an attitude toward the unavoidable. The testimonies of Holocaust survivors echo Frankl's insight with stark clarity. Consider the words of Elie Wiesel, who, after surviving the camps, reflected, "The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. The opposite of suffering is not pleasure, it's meaning." In an interview recorded decades after the war, a survivor named Miriam recalled a moment in the infirmary of a concentration camp. "We were all dying," she whispered, "but a fellow prisoner whispered a prayer in Hebrew, and for a brief instant the pain in my ribs seemed to lift. It was as if the words gave the suffering a shape, a story, and that made it bearable." Here we see Frankl's principle in action. The meaning derived from a shared ritual transformed an excruciating physical reality into a moment of spiritual endurance. Logotherapy has been adapted into modern therapeutic practices that address chronic illness. In a clinical setting, a therapist might ask a patient with rheumatoid arthritis, "What values can you still pursue despite the stiffness in your joints?" The patient may discover that mentoring a young apprentice in their craft provides a sense of continuity that outweighs the physical limitation. By reframing the pain as a context for living a valued life, the suffering becomes a catalyst rather than a condemnation. Mindfulness-based stress reduction, or MBSR, offers another pathway that marries Buddhist philosophy with empirical science. Developed by John Kabat-Zinn in the late 1970s, MBSR invites participants to cultivate a non-judgmental awareness of the present moment, observing sensations, thoughts, and emotions as they arise and pass. The Buddhist roots are evident in the emphasis on anicca, impermanence, and dukkha, the unsatisfactoriness of clinging. In the words of the Buddha, all conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. In practice, participants learn to notice the sting of a migraine without immediately labeling it as terrible or unbearable. This subtle shift reduces the secondary suffering that arises from resistance and rumination. Neuroscientific investigations of MBSR have revealed structural changes in the brain. After an 8-week course, participants often show increased cortical thickness in the prefrontal cortex and the insula, regions associated with attention regulation and interoceptive awareness. Moreover, functional connectivity between the default mode network and the salience network becomes more balanced, suggesting a reduced tendency toward mind-wandering catastrophizing thoughts. In a randomized controlled trial of breast cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy, those who completed MBSR reported lower pain scores and reduced opioid consumption, despite receiving the same medical regimen as the control group. The practice, therefore, does not merely provide a philosophical coping mechanism, it reshapes the neural substrates of pain perception. Cognitive behavioral reframing, a cornerstone of modern psychotherapy, offers yet another lens through which we can reinterpret chronic illness. The premise is simple: thoughts influence emotions, which in turn influence behavior and physiological responses. A patient with chronic fatigue syndrome might hold the belief, if I push myself, I will collapse. This catastrophic anticipation heightens anxiety, which can exacerbate fatigue through dysregulated autonomic function. By challenging the belief, asking, what evidence do we have that a modest increase in activity leads to collapse, the therapist helps the patient construct a more nuanced narrative. I can engage in short, purposeful activities, and my body will adapt over time. This reframing does not deny the reality of the illness, it acknowledges it while opening space for agency. The efficacy of such reframing is supported by meta-analyses indicating that CBT reduces pain intensity and improves functional outcomes in conditions ranging from fibromyalgia to irritable bowel syndrome. Neuroimaging studies suggest that CBT can normalize hyperactivity in the anterior cingulate cortex, a region implicated in the emotional dimension of pain. In this way, the mind's reinterpretation of sensory input translates into measurable changes in brain activity, a vivid illustration of the philosophical claim that meaning is not merely abstract, but embodied. Yet for every voice that celebrates the transformative power of meaning, there are dissenting perspectives that demand our attention. Radical physicalists such as the philosopher Daniel Dennett argue that attributing intrinsic meaning to pain anthropomorphizes a purely biochemical event. From this standpoint, the brain's firing patterns are the entire story. The meaning we ascribe is a post hoc narrative that serves evolutionary purposes, such as motivating avoidance of harm. In a 1995 essay, Dennett wrote, "The brain is a kind of algorithmic machine. The stories we tell about it are useful fictions, not ontological truths." The radical physicalist would caution us against reifying meaning as an extra layer of reality, suggesting that doing so risks conflating descriptive language with causal mechanisms. The anti-psychiatry movement, epitomized by Thomas Schass, takes a different angle. In his provocative book The Myth of Mental Illness, 1961, Schass claimed that labeling suffering as a medical disease turns normal human distress into a pathology, thereby justifying coercive interventions. He argued mental illness is a metaphor, not a disease. From this view, the medicalization of suffering, whether through the prescription of antidepressants for existential despair or the categorization of chronic pain as a disorder, can diminish personal responsibility and undermine the individual's capacity to find meaning on their own terms. Schass warned that the psychiatric establishment, in its zeal to alleviate distress, might inadvertently strip individuals of the very agency that philosophers like Frankl deem essential. These critiques are not merely academic footnotes. They force us to examine the ethical terrain of our interventions. If we accept that meaning can be cultivated, do we risk imposing a particular worldview on those who might simply wish to experience their pain without the pressure to find a purpose? Conversely, if we reject any intrinsic meaning, do we abandon a powerful tool for resilience? The tension between these poles invites a nuanced stance, one that honors both the biological realities of pain and the human capacity to ascribe significance. To navigate this tension, we can look back to the Stoics, whose practice of premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, offers a practical bridge. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus advised his students to imagine the loss of a cherished possession or the onset of illness before it occurs. By rehearsing the emotional response in advance, the mind is prepared to meet the actual event with composure. This is not a denial of suffering, but a strategic rehearsal that reduces the shock and the subsequent amplification of pain. Modern resilience research echoes this ancient technique. Studies on psychological inoculation demonstrate that individuals who engage in anticipatory coping strategies exhibit lower cortisol responses when faced with real stressors. In a longitudinal study of firefighters, those who practiced scenario-based mental rehearsal reported fewer burnout symptoms and lower rates of chronic musculoskeletal pain, suggesting that the Stoic exercise has measurable health benefits. Resilience, however, is not a static trait but a dynamic process. Researchers like Anne Maston have described it as ordinary magic, emphasizing that everyday adaptive systems, supportive relationships, effective problem-solving skills, a sense of purpose, combine to buffer against adversity. When we integrate this with the neuroplastic insights discussed earlier, a picture emerges. Resilience is both a psychological skill set and a neurobiological capacity to rewire pathways in response to stress. Mindfulness, CBT, and even the Stoic premeditation can be seen as deliberate practices that sculpt the brain's architecture toward flexibility. Let us pause now to hear a contemporary voice that embodies this integration. Dr. Susan, a neurologist who has lived with multiple sclerosis for over 2 decades, shares her story in a recent interview. "When my first flare left me unable to walk, I felt the world collapse," she says, her voice soft but steady. "I could have surrendered to the narrative that my body was betraying me. Instead, I turned to a blend of practices. I attend an MBSR group, I keep a log of moments when I feel a sense of purpose, like mentoring a medical student, and I work with a therapist who helps me reframe the pain as a signal, not a sentence. Over time, my scans showed reduced activation in the pain matrix during flare-ups, and I feel more present, even when the fatigue returns." Dr. Susan's testimony illustrates how the philosophical, psychological, and physiological strands intertwine in lived experience. Returning to the placebo effect, we encounter a subtle but profound philosophical implication. The power of belief itself can be a therapeutic agent. In the 2000s, researchers at Harvard conducted a study in which patients with Parkinson's disease received a saline infusion they believed was a dopamine-boosting drug. Brain imaging revealed increased dopamine release in the striatum, and motor symptoms improved. The mere expectation of treatment triggered the very neurotransmitter the disease depletes. This phenomenon forces us to reconsider the Cartesian division of mind and body. If belief can modulate neurochemistry, then the mind is not a passive observer but an active participant in the body's physiology. Yet, as the radical physicalist might caution, the belief itself is a pattern of neural firing. The mind is simply the brain's emergent property. The philosophical question then becomes, does it matter whether we label it mind or brain if the functional outcome, pain relief, is the same? The answer may lie in how we choose to engage with our own experience and whether we see ourselves as agents capable of shaping our neural landscape. The dialogue between philosophy and science also raises ethical considerations about the use of placebos in clinical practice. Some argue that prescribing a placebo without deception, by framing it as a mind-body enhancer, honors patient autonomy while harnessing its benefits. Others contend that any form of deception erodes trust. This debate mirrors the anti-psychiatry critique of paternalism in mental health treatment. If we acknowledge that meaning can be therapeutically potent, we must also respect the individual's right to define their own narrative, rather than imposing a prescribed purpose. In weaving together these threads, we see that the philosophy of suffering is not an abstract discourse confined to lecture halls. It is a living conversation that informs how we treat chronic pain in the clinic, how we support a veteran coping with PTSD, how we design public health policies that recognize the social determinants of health. The biopsychosocial model reminds policymakers that alleviating suffering requires more than medication. It demands community support, economic stability, and cultural narratives that validate pain. Neuroplasticity teaches us that early interventions, whether physical therapy, mindfulness training, or supportive counseling, can prevent the hardening of pain pathways. Placebo research invites us to cultivate hope and positive expectations ethically. Logotherapy urges us to help individuals discover a purpose that transcends their affliction. Mindfulness offers a practice that quiets the mental chatter that fuels suffering, while CBT provides concrete tools to reshape destructive thought patterns. Stoic premeditation reminds us that preparing for loss can reduce the shock of its arrival, and resilience research shows that the capacity to bounce back is nurtured by relationships, meaning, and adaptive coping. As we reflect on these insights, a question arises. How might we integrate them into a coherent approach to suffering that honors both the biological reality of pain and the human yearning for meaning? One possible answer lies in a stepped, personalized model of care. At the first step, clinicians assess the biological contributors, tissue damage, inflammation, neurological dysfunction, and address them with appropriate pharmacological or surgical interventions. Simultaneously, they screen for psychological factors, catastrophic thinking, depression, anxiety, and introduce evidence-based therapies like CBT or mindfulness, tailored to the individual's preferences. The third step involves the social dimension, connecting patients with support groups, community resources, or vocational rehabilitation, thereby embedding them in a network that validates and assists their experience. Throughout, clinicians can invite conversations about meaning, drawing on logotherapy techniques to explore values and purpose. This integrative pathway respects the biopsychosocial model while acknowledging the philosophical depth that each person brings to their own suffering. In practice, such an approach might look like this. Maria, a 48-year-old teacher diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, visits her rheumatologist. After adjusting her disease-modifying medication, her doctor refers her to a pain psychologist who introduces CBT strategies to challenge her belief that any activity will worsen my joints. Together, they set realistic goals, walking to the park for 10 minutes each day while monitoring pain levels. Maria also joins a local support group where she shares stories with fellow patients, discovering that mentoring a younger colleague gives her a renewed sense of purpose. She enrolls in an 8-week MBSR program, learning to observe flare-ups without immediate judgment, noticing that her stress levels decline and her pain ratings improve. Over months, her functional MRI shows decreased activation in the insula during movement, reflecting the neuroplastic changes we discussed. Maria's journey illustrates how the convergence of biological treatment, psychological reframing, social connection, and meaning-making can transform suffering into a more manageable, even enriching, aspect of life. Yet we must remain vigilant to the critiques that warn against over-medicalizing or imposing meaning. The radical physicalist would remind us that neuroimaging cannot capture the totality of experience, and that reductionist explanations risk overlooking the lived, cultural, and existential dimensions of pain. The anti-psychiatry perspective would caution us to avoid labeling every emotional turmoil as a disorder, lest we strip individuals of their agency. The balance, therefore, lies in offering tools without coercion, in inviting meaning without demanding it, and in recognizing that some individuals may find solace simply in the acceptance of suffering as part of the human condition, without the need to transform it into a purposeful narrative. In closing, let us return to the ancient Stoic sage who, in his Enchiridion, wrote, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them." This simple maxim resonates across millennia, echoing the modern neuroscientist's discovery that the brain's interpretation of sensory input can amplify or diminish pain, and the logotherapist's assertion that meaning can be cultivated even in the bleakest circumstances. The mind-body dualism that once seemed an unassailable divide now appears as a fluid continuum, where beliefs, expectations, and neurochemistry co-create the lived reality of suffering. By integrating philosophical insight with psychological practice and scientific evidence, we open a pathway that honors the full complexity of human pain, its biological roots, its psychological contours, its social textures, and its existential depths. May we, as listeners and seekers, carry forward this integrated understanding, allowing it to inform how we care for ourselves and for one another, turning the raw stone of suffering into a stepping stone toward greater insight, compassion, and resilience. We begin by asking ourselves what it means to suffer in an age when the boundaries of the individual and the collective have become increasingly porous. When the air we breathe turns toxic, when algorithms learn to predict our desires and our anxieties, when histories of oppression echo through generations, the old philosophical questions about pain, meaning, and responsibility resurface with a new urgency. In this segment, we will trace how contemporary thinkers translate age-old insights about suffering into the language of climate change, artificial intelligence, and social justice, and we will examine the fierce ethical debates that arise when we try to balance individual anguish against broader calculations of well-being. Consider first the climate crisis, which scholars such as Timothy Morton have called a dark ecology that forces us to confront a form of collective existential suffering. The rising seas, the relentless heat waves, the loss of species, all of these are not merely environmental statistics. They are, for millions of people, lived experiences of fear, grief, and disorientation. A farmer in the Sahel watches his fields turn to dust and feels the weight of an invisible future that threatens his children's very right to survive. A small island nation faces the prospect of disappearance, and with it the erasure of language, culture, and identity. The philosopher Jonathan Lear reminds us that the suffering of the world is not a peripheral problem, it is the very condition of our being together. In this sense, climate change generates a kind of shared anguish that cannot be reduced to isolated pain points. It is a structural wound that permeates the social fabric. The ethical challenge, then, is to ask how we ought to respond. The Buddhist middle way, articulated in the Sutra of the Six Perfections, suggests that we avoid the extremes of denial and despair, cultivating a compassionate engagement that acknowledges suffering without being overwhelmed by it. This middle way invites us to see climate-induced distress not as a call for fatalistic resignation, nor as an excuse for reckless optimism, but as a catalyst for a compassionate praxis that aligns personal well-being with planetary health. Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach offers a concrete framework. We should aim to secure the basic capabilities of life, bodily health, and bodily integrity for all, recognizing that climate-driven suffering threatens precisely those capabilities. When we ask, what does a life worth living look like under a changing climate, we are forced to confront the moral imperative to protect not only current individuals, but also future generations whose very possibilities are at stake. Turning now to the digital realm, we encounter a different texture of suffering, one that is mediated by algorithms, data, and the ever-present glow of screens. The term algorithmic pain may sound like a metaphor, yet it captures a real phenomenon. Recommendation systems that amplify anxiety, social media feeds that trigger comparison, and predictive policing tools that reinforce marginalization. Shoshana Zuboff, in her analysis of surveillance capitalism, warns that the extraction of emotional data turns human affect into a commodity, turning our moments of vulnerability into profit. When a teenager scrolls through a feed that constantly highlights idealized bodies and lifestyles, the resulting sense of inadequacy is not a fleeting feeling. It can become a chronic condition of low self-esteem, depression, and even self-harm. In this way, digital platforms become sites of structural suffering, where the architecture of the system itself produces harm. From a virtue ethics perspective, the question becomes, what character traits should we cultivate in a world where technology can both alleviate and exacerbate suffering? Aristotle would ask us to develop practical wisdom, phronses, to navigate the digital landscape, discerning which tools serve the flourishing of the soul and which merely feed our appetites for novelty and validation. Contemporary virtue ethicists such as Rosalind Hursthouse argue that a virtuous agent would resist the lure of endless scrolling, instead fostering temperance and authenticity. The Buddhist teaching on right livelihood also offers guidance. If the very platforms we use are built on the extraction of suffering, can we ethically continue to support them? This tension is palpable in the ongoing debates about regulating social media, where some advocate for robust content moderation as a form of digital compassion, while others warn that such interventions risk censorship. The third arena where suffering takes on a structural dimension is the arena of social justice, where systemic oppression manifests as chronic, intergenerational trauma. The Black Lives Matter movement, which erupted globally after the murder of George Floyd, provides a vivid case study of how collective pain can become a catalyst for profound social transformation. Historian Isabel Wilkerson, in Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, describes the United States as a caste system that inflicts a deep, inherited wound upon black bodies and minds. The protests that swept the streets of Minneapolis, London, and Seoul were not merely reactions to a single act of violence. They were expressions of a cumulative history of slavery, segregation, police brutality, and economic disenfranchisement. As the poet James Baldwin famously wrote, "The place of the Negro in America is the place of the outsider, the alien, the other." This otherness is not a metaphorical distance, but a lived reality that produces chronic stress. Higher rates of hypertension and reduced life expectancy, a phenomenon scholars term weathering. In the context of the BLM protests, we see suffering articulated both as personal trauma and as a collective claim for redress. The movement's emphasis on defund the police and reparations is an attempt to address the structural conditions that generate suffering rather than merely treating its symptoms. Nussbaum's capabilities approach again proves useful. By securing the capability of affiliation and control over one's environment, we can begin to dismantle the institutional mechanisms that perpetuate pain. Moreover, the movement invites us to reconsider the moral weight of intergenerational trauma. Philosophers like Paul Ricoeur have argued that memory and responsibility are intertwined. We are called to bear witness to the past in order to heal the present. In this light, the protests become a form of ethical praxis, a public, embodied act of bearing witness that seeks to transform suffering into solidarity. The COVID-19 pandemic offers another stark illustration of contemporary suffering, especially when we focus on the mental health crisis that unfolded alongside the viral outbreak. When governments imposed lockdowns, schools closed, and economies stalled, the world witnessed a surge in anxiety, depression, and loneliness. A study published in The Lancet in 2021 reported that the prevalence of depressive symptoms rose by 27% globally during the first year of the pandemic. These numbers are more than statistics. They represent countless individuals who found their routines shattered, their social bonds strained, and their sense of purpose eroded. The philosopher Simone Weil, writing in The Need for Roots, observed that the most terrible thing that can happen to a person is to be stripped of the meaning of his existence. The pandemic stripped many of the ordinary meanings that anchored their lives: work, community gatherings, even the simple act of walking down a familiar street. Yet the pandemic also revealed how suffering can be a catalyst for communal empathy and solidarity. Mutual aid networks sprang up in cities across the globe, with neighbors delivering groceries to the elderly, volunteers sewing masks, and online support groups offering spaces for shared grief. These acts echo the Aristotelian notion of philia, friendship grounded in mutual concern for the good of the other. From a virtue ethics standpoint, the crisis highlighted the importance of compassion as a cultivated habit. The philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre would argue that the pandemic created a practice of caring that, when nurtured, can become a source of moral identity. At the same time, the crisis exposed stark inequities. Low-income workers faced higher exposure risk, essential workers endured relentless stress, and marginalized communities suffered disproportionately high mortality rates. This disparity forces us to confront the ethical question of whether we can justify policies that alleviate collective suffering while leaving the most vulnerable to bear the brunt. In confronting these contemporary manifestations of suffering, we encounter two powerful counterarguments that challenge the primacy of individual pain in ethical deliberation. The first is a libertarian critique that frames suffering as a market signal, an essential feedback mechanism that guides resource allocation. Thinkers such as Friedrich Hayek have argued that the price system transmits information about scarcity and preference, and that attempts to smooth out suffering through regulation risk distorting this information flow. From this perspective, the pain of a worker demanding higher wages signals a shortage of labor. The discomfort of a consumer facing a higher price signals scarcity. To intervene by imposing price caps, for example, would, the libertarian claims, mute the signal and lead to inefficiencies, ultimately harming the very people the intervention seeks to protect. The second counterargument comes from a utilitarian strand that privileges aggregate happiness over individual pain. Classical utilitarians such as Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill posited that the right action is the one that maximizes overall utility, even if it entails sacrificing the well-being of a few. In the context of climate policy, a utilitarian might argue that imposing stringent emissions standards could raise the cost of energy, causing short-term hardship for low-income households, but that the long-term benefit of averting catastrophic climate change justifies that sacrifice. Similarly, a utilitarian approach to AI governance might endorse the deployment of predictive policing tools if they statistically reduce overall crime, even if they disproportionately affect certain communities. Both of these counterarguments raise important questions, yet they also reveal blind spots. The libertarian view assumes that all suffering can be accurately quantified and that market mechanisms are neutral conduits of information. Yet the very notion of market signal presupposes a level playing field, a condition that climate change, digital surveillance, and systemic racism demonstrably violate. When a community lacks access to clean water, the market price of water no longer reflects a fair signal. It reflects a power imbalance that perpetuates suffering. Likewise, the utilitarian calculus often abstracts away the lived reality of those whose pain is counted as a mere statistical weight. The philosopher Amartya Sen, in his critique of welfarist utilitarianism, warns that the reduction of human life to a single metric of happiness erases the pluralism of values that actually matter to people. By focusing solely on aggregate outcomes, we risk silencing the voices of those who experience suffering as a violation of dignity, not merely a decrement in pleasure. These critiques lead us back to the earlier theodicy debates that have long haunted philosophers of suffering. In the medieval discourse, Augustine argued that suffering serves a divine pedagogical purpose, a way to turn the soul toward God. In contrast, the problem of evil, as articulated by Epicurus, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent, forces us to grapple with the compatibility of an all-good, all-powerful deity with the existence of suffering. Contemporary theodicy has shifted from a strictly theological arena to a secular one, where the evil of climate change, algorithmic bias, or structural racism becomes the new problem of suffering that demands moral explanation. The Buddhist middle way offers a way out of this binary. Rather than seeking a metaphysical justification, it invites us to observe suffering, understand its causes, and cultivate a compassionate response that alleviates it. This approach dovetails with Nussbaum's capabilities framework, which does not ask why suffering exists, but rather what conditions are necessary for individuals to flourish despite its presence. To illustrate the practical stakes of these philosophical debates, let us examine two concrete case studies in greater depth. The first, as mentioned, is the global mental health crisis triggered by COVID-19. In the early months of 2020, the World Health Organization warned that the pandemic would exacerbate existing mental health conditions and generate new ones. Governments responded in varied ways. Some expanded teletherapy services, others launched public awareness campaigns, and a few, like New Zealand, incorporated mental health considerations into their elimination strategy, recognizing that a healthy populace is essential for societal resilience. Yet the response also highlighted ethical tensions. In many low-income countries, mental health resources were already scarce, and the pandemic further strained these systems. The utilitarian argument that the greatest good is served by allocating limited medical supplies to life-saving treatments rather than mental health services clashed with the virtue-ethical claim that compassion demands we attend to psychological suffering as an integral part of health. The libertarian critique resurfaced when some governments introduced digital passes that required proof of vaccination, prompting debates about the right to privacy versus public safety. Critics argued that such passes could become tools of social coercion, imposing a form of suffering on those who resisted vaccination for personal or philosophical reasons. The pandemic thus became a laboratory for testing how different ethical frameworks handle the tension between collective well-being and individual autonomy. The second case study is the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020 and 2021, which brought intergenerational trauma to the forefront of public discourse. The protests were not only a response to police violence, but also a reclamation of narrative, a collective assertion that the pain of centuries should not be ignored. In cities like Ferguson, Minneapolis, and even abroad in cities like Paris and Sydney, murals, chants, and sit-ins transformed public spaces into sites of mourning and hope. The movement's demand for reparations, financial, educational, and symbolic, directly engages with Nussbaum's capability of control over one's environment. By seeking to dismantle the structural barriers that limit Black communities' access to quality education, housing, and healthcare, the movement embodies a concrete application of philosophical theories of justice. Moreover, the protests sparked a wave of corporate introspection. Companies issued statements, pledged donations, and in some cases, restructured hiring practices. Critics, however, raised libertarian concerns that such corporate activism amounted to forced virtue signaling, arguing that businesses should not be compelled to address societal suffering beyond their profit motive. Meanwhile, utilitarians pointed to the potential social unrest that could arise from radical policy changes, suggesting a cautious approach that balances the desire for swift redress with the need to maintain social cohesion. Both case studies demonstrate how suffering can serve as a catalyst for ethical reflection and policy innovation. They also reveal the limits of any single philosophical lens. The pandemic's mental health crisis underscores the necessity of integrating virtue ethics, cultivating compassion and resilience, with capabilities theory that insists on concrete institutional support. The BLM protests highlight the importance of recognizing structural suffering as a form of injustice that cannot be reduced to individual grievances, echoing the Buddhist insight that the root of suffering is attachment to a self that is separate from others. By weaving together these perspectives, we can begin to construct a more holistic response to contemporary suffering. Let us now turn to the realm of artificial intelligence, where the concept of algorithmic pain becomes especially vivid. Imagine a young woman named Maya who uses a popular dating app. The app's recommendation engine, trained on millions of interactions, begins to surface profiles that match her previous preferences, but also subtly nudges her toward options that have higher engagement metrics. Over time, Maya notices a pattern. The matches she receives are increasingly similar, reinforcing a narrow set of aesthetic standards. She feels a growing sense of inadequacy, as if her own identity does not fit the algorithm's template. This personal narrative illustrates how algorithmic design can produce a kind of self-inflicted suffering, one that is mediated by invisible code. Philosophers of technology such as Hubert Dreyfus have warned that the embodied mind cannot be fully captured by computational models, and that attempts to simulate human desire often result in distortions. The Buddhist teaching on right intention asks us to examine the motivations behind our creations. Are we building systems that alleviate suffering, or are we reinforcing a cycle of craving? From a virtue ethical standpoint, designers should cultivate the virtues of humility and responsibility, recognizing that their work has moral consequences that extend beyond market success. The libertarian defense that the market will correct any harmful algorithm because users will switch to better platforms fails to account for network effects that lock users into dominant ecosystems, limiting real choice. Moreover, the utilitarian calculus that favors overall user engagement can hide the fact that a small but significant minority experiences deep emotional harm. In this way, the AI arena forces us to confront the same tension that climate ethics faces: how to balance aggregate benefits against concentrated harms. We can also draw a historical analogy to the Industrial Revolution, when factories introduced new forms of labor that increased productivity but also inflicted physical and psychological suffering on workers. At the time, utilitarians like Bentham argued that the increase in overall wealth justified the hardships endured by factory laborers. Yet later, thinkers such as Karl Marx highlighted how systemic exploitation produced alienation, a form of suffering that could not be measured in simple utility terms. The modern digital economy reproduces a similar pattern. The efficiency gains of algorithmic recommendation systems are celebrated, while the subtle erosion of autonomy and self-esteem is often dismissed as an acceptable cost. By recalling the lessons of the past, we can see that a solely outcome-oriented approach may overlook the qualitative dimensions of suffering that virtue ethics and Buddhist mindfulness emphasize. Returning to climate change, we encounter a striking example of collective suffering in the experience of solastalgia, the distress produced by environmental change in one's home landscape. Residents of the Australian town of Coober Pedy, once known for its cool underground homes, now confront rising temperatures that make even subterranean living uncomfortable. Their sense of place, identity, and belonging is eroding, leading to a pervasive melancholy that psychologists describe as environmental grief. This phenomenon resonates with the Buddhist notion of dukkha as the unsatisfactoriness inherent in impermanent conditions. Yet, unlike the Buddhist teaching that encourages acceptance, climate ethics calls us to act, to transform the conditions that generate such grief. The philosopher Thomas Nagel, in his essay, The View from Nowhere, reminds us that the moral significance of suffering does not diminish because it is shared. Rather, its shared nature can amplify our responsibility. When entire communities experience solastalgia, the moral imperative to intervene becomes collective, not merely individual. In addressing collective suffering, policy proposals often invoke the concept of just transition, a framework that seeks to shift economies away from fossil fuels while ensuring that workers and communities are not left behind. This proposal embodies Nussbaum's capabilities approach. It aims to preserve the capability to earn a dignified livelihood while protecting the capability of a healthy environment. Critics from a libertarian standpoint argue that mandating such transitions infringes on property rights and market freedom. Utilitarians, on the other hand, may argue that the short-term economic costs outweigh the long-term benefits, especially for developing nations still striving to lift their populations out of poverty. The philosophical debate thus becomes a negotiation between respecting individual rights, maximizing overall welfare, and honoring the inherent dignity of those who suffer under environmental duress. The interplay of these ethical perspectives can be seen in the ongoing debate over carbon pricing. A carbon tax, in theory, internalizes the external costs of greenhouse gas emissions, aligning market incentives with ecological sustainability. Proponents claim that it reduces suffering by decreasing future climate harms. Libertarians counter that any tax is a coercive instrument that violates liberty. Utilitarians may accept the tax if it leads to the greatest net reduction in suffering, even if it imposes short-term pain on certain industries. The Buddhist middle way offers a different lens. It asks whether the policy fosters attachment to material wealth or encourages a more mindful relationship with consumption. By integrating these viewpoints, policymakers can design carbon pricing mechanisms that are transparent, equitable, and accompanied by revenue recycling measures that support vulnerable communities, thereby addressing both individual and collective dimensions of suffering. We have so far examined three domains: climate, digital, and social justice, each revealing distinct yet overlapping forms of suffering. To bring these strands together, let us consider a composite scenario. A low-income neighborhood in Detroit, where residents face polluted air from nearby industrial plants, limited broadband access that isolates them from telehealth mental health services, and a history of policing that has eroded trust in public institutions. The community's suffering is multi-layered. Physical health is compromised by environmental toxins, psychological well-being is strained by digital exclusion, and social cohesion is undermined by systemic oppression. A holistic ethical response must therefore be interdisciplinary. It could involve installing green infrastructure to improve air quality, addressing the climate dimension, while simultaneously expanding affordable high-speed internet to enable access to mental health resources, thereby mitigating digital suffering. Finally, community-led policing reforms, informed by restorative justice principles, could repair the relational wounds of systemic oppression. This integrated approach reflects what Nussbaum calls the political liberalism of capabilities, wherein public policy is judged by how well it expands each person's real freedoms to lead a life they have reason to value. In reflecting on these contemporary applications, we might ask, does the philosophical study of suffering merely catalog pain, or does it point us toward a roadmap for transformation? The answer, I believe, lies in the convergence of several ancient and modern insights. Theodicy debates teach us that suffering cannot be dismissed as a necessary evil. It demands explanation and response. The Buddhist middle way reminds us that the path lies between denial and fatalism, urging mindful engagement. Virtue ethics insists that compassion must be cultivated as a habit, not a fleeting sentiment. Nussbaum's capabilities approach provides a concrete metric for evaluating whether policies truly alleviate suffering. When we weave these threads together, we obtain a tapestry that not only interprets suffering, but also prescribes how to act in its presence. Let us pause for a moment and consider the words of the ancient philosopher Seneca, who wrote, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it." In a world where suffering is amplified by climate upheaval, digital overload, and entrenched injustice, wasting time means failing to act with compassion, failing to listen to the cries of those who suffer, and failing to build structures that safeguard well-being. The challenge before us, then, is not merely academic. It is practical, urgent, and profoundly moral. As we conclude this exploration of contemporary applications and ethical debates, I invite you to reflect on three guiding questions. First, how do you perceive the relationship between individual pain and collective responsibility in your own life? Second, which ethical framework, libertarian, utilitarian, virtue ethical, or capability-oriented, resonates most with your intuition about how to address suffering in the world? And third, what concrete actions can you take, however small, to embody the middle way of compassionate engagement amid the crises that surround us? In the words of the Buddha, better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace. May our words, our thoughts, and our deeds become that single word of peace, a beacon that guides us through the suffering that defines our age, and toward a future where compassion is not an abstract ideal but a lived reality.